I thought I would just open the discussion with a question or so from the von Hildebrand side, and let Sherif then respond, and then Jules may have a question also. So let me pick up on the idea that there's maybe a concreteness in von Hildebrand, in contrast to what you call the analytic style of Grisey, that helps us add a dimension to our thinking about man and woman and marriage. Let me see if I understand what that kind of enhancement might be. This seems to me an example of it. So you open, as you did in the presentation and in chapter 2 of your book, with the conjugal union, with and from a biological point of view. There is this interpenetration of bodily organs so that man and woman in their sexual union are like a kind of organism, so coordinated to one goal is their activity in that sexual union. And from there, Sherif moves to the comprehensive union of man and woman. Now, when I think about the work of von Hildebrand, I think he would contribute something like this. Yes, indeed, there is that biological interpenetration, and it has this almost organism-like character, just as Sherif says. And this leads us into the unique kind of comprehensive union that distinguishes marriage. But von Hildebrand, I can well imagine, would also say, let's not keep the discussion too biological. There are other aspects that we can gather from, let's say, a phenomenology of our embodiment that help us understand more deeply how bodily union works in and functions in sexual union. And so you have in von Hildebrand, we studied it together from the opening pages of the Purity book, this unique intimacy of sexuality, this unique depth. It's not like another bodily appetite. You disclose something intimate when you are in some sexual encounter with another. You run the risk of throwing yourself away if you disclose it under inappropriate conditions, without a marital commitment. But with the right commitments, that sexual self-disclosure that reveals this intimate self tied to your sexuality, that becomes a vehicle for the marital self-giving that is enacted in the one flesh union. So I think von Hildebrand would say the biological level, the interpenetration of genital organs, the unity that is organism-like in that bodily union, that needs to be completed with things like this intimacy of sexuality. And that's connected to the shame that we discussed with Wojtyła. Just because something very intimate is touched upon in sexuality, there's this need to cover it and not let it just be exposed to anyone. So I don't know if that's the kind of, let's say, concrete elaboration based on a kind of phenomenology of embodiment that would unpack more this point of departure in sexual union and explain more of the comprehensive union that can result.
Sure. That's a helpful question. I think the general answer is yes, and the details may be important. So one detail, I think, is that there's temptation in that approach. And the temptation is to draw too sharp an initial boundary between the biological and the personal. And to say that the biological needs to be subsumed into the personal, in a way, if it's taken too far, can presuppose that these are totally foreign things to each other, and you need an effort to make them integrated. And so I don't think that that's what the primary focus of von Hildebrand's reflections on this, but I want to first clear away that misunderstanding of it. I think you see that misunderstanding rejected in St. Paul, for example. And this is a passage that von Hildebrand quotes when he says, St. Paul talks about a man becoming one flesh with a prostitute. And he uses it, that's such a striking example, because that's the case where we know there's no family life in view. Far from any family life, there's not even any kind of real emotional connection in view. In fact, it's kind of inconvenient if one develops. It's purely economic transaction. I get a gratification, you get money. And he says, even there's a one flesh union, there's a union, in some sense, already of persons. Because the body is not just external to the person. And so, I think that does have implications, right? It has implications that match a lot of what von Hildebrand says about this, which is that if at one level of the person there's already this unity, then in the other aspects of the person there should match that reality. And that's why it's not an option to choose casual sex without it being degrading. I mean, this relates to a question we heard in the first segment on Jules' talk. The reason it's not an option is because you can't choose to make your body a part of you or not. It's not by your own commitment or by the way you're thinking about what you're doing that it becomes a part of you. It already always is a part of you. The only question is whether you are going to, in the ways that you have control over, reflect that truth or not. And so I think actually that the shame stuff corresponds to this very nicely. So shame is about protecting, well, it can be about guilt in one respect, but it can also be about protecting a good from misuse. Well, if you could just decide that your body was not going to be a real part of you today, or that it's always been outside of you, and so today you don't care how it gets used, then shame wouldn't make sense as a general reaction. The only reason it makes sense is because the body's really already a part of you, and there's ripeness for abuse of you and of your person, and not just of some property that you find especially useful. Having said all of that, absolutely, I think that the kind of emotional intimacy that a couple should try to foster in marriage is beautifully spelled out by von Hildebrand. And sometimes where I think people are worried that he's excluding more mundane possibilities that maybe most of us find ourselves in most of the time, a kind of less than rapturous relationship. It's where people are where it's not, there isn't enough clarity that what's being talked about is an ideal and not a condition of there being a marriage, right? So I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind as we go through this, both von Hildebrand's work and others' work, is where are we talking about the thing you have to have a real marriage at all? And where are we talking about the things that you should aspire to, but which you can fall short of without violating anybody's dignity?
Just one small follow-up there. That's extremely important, that my being sexually embodied is not my choice, that I am so by my very nature as an embodied person. And you do find that in von Hildebrand in this way, that whoever does to exercise his or her sexuality irresponsibly, thereby, as he says, desecrates himself, squanders himself, dissipates himself, throws himself away. And it's not in anybody's power just to withdraw from our sexuality so that it's now just something, so that my body is just instrumentally used. It's inescapably embodied. And the alternative is either self-destructive, self-defiling sexuality, or sexuality in the service of the self-giving So, yeah.
Yes, thank you also for your talk. I have several questions, but I'll just stick to one. Von Hildebrand, especially in the Nature of Love book, but also in other places, spends a lot of time elaborating the distinction between various kinds of love. So, most drastically, perhaps, neighbor love is very different from conjugal love, but also the love between parents and children, or children for their parents, friends, and then he draws out, I think, very helpfully the characteristics that distinguish these into very different kinds of love, and he says it's only the one kind, namely the conjugal love, that kind of love that naturally leads to marriage and also naturally is related to sex. Earlier on during the week, someone reminded me of the passage where he says that friendship plus sex is repugnant. And I thought that in your presentation you didn't emphasize that enough, perhaps. I think you said that the danger is that the love, if you focus on the love as such, that you then make the difference between various kinds of relationship a matter of degree, stronger or lesser. And so that would be one question, is that really the case? I mean, it seems to me Van Hildebrand sort of rather successfully shows that there are these different kinds. And then he connects that with the relation between the one kind of love, namely conjugal love, and marriage. And I wonder if it wouldn't be, also for the public debate, if it wouldn't be very helpful if we could challenge persuasively the assumption that seems to be so widespread that the love is the same between same-sex couples. I don't know, there are many other configurations out there being proposed, and between a man and a woman that are desiring to get married. So do you think that's not a promising avenue at all, or what?
Sure. That's great. So on the first point, it's definitely right that a lot of the passages in von Hildebrand speak to the idea that there are different basic forms of love. And conjugal love is just one of them. It's what finds its fulfillment in marriage. It's the only one that does. And then family life through that. What I was concerned about were passages that tried to spell out the contours of that love without or prior to any reference to bodily union and family life. And one of the moves that gets made there is von Hildebrand says, marriage is the only relationship in which, or conjugal love, I don't remember if it's conjugal love or marriage, but one or the other is the only kind of context in which love is the central point. And he says, in friendship, you have a kind of focus on the activity. In marriage, maybe in conjugal love more generally, you have a focus on the love itself. And it's the fact that love is so central to marriage as opposed to other forms of relationship that distinguishes marriage at all. And I thought that was, at some level, it certainly matches certain things in experience. People in a marriage or in a romantic relationship talk about their relationship in ways that friends typically don't talk about the state of repair of their friendship. You're not as self-conscious about, people don't come up to you and ask like, oh, how's your health? Like, how's your friendship going? Like, it'd be a strange question. But it's perfectly natural to say, oh, how are things with your wife, or something like that, even if it's invasive. And so I think there's something to that in experience. But on the other hand, I think sometimes the reason we can talk that way is that we we tend to conflate different types of friendship, or so, we think of the kind of more easygoing, happy-go-lucky, like, this is my hiking buddy, and he's a good guy. And there are, even in the scriptures, in the tradition, there are other models of friendship, or friendship of a different kind, where these more spiritual values are more central. And so I guess I just thought that it becomes hard if you separate, if you want to start giving an account of conjugal love, even before you get to the kind of union that it points toward. It becomes hard to get a grip on what makes it distinctive. And von Hildebrand talks a lot about complementarity as being integral to that. And I think one area that's ripe for development is to what extent that's true. I mean, and one reason it would be useful, even apart from the sort of policy debates and apart from the intellectual value of filling in that blank, is that it would give shape to the kind of emotional regard you should have in other forms of relationship, right? I mean, if there really is, even before you get to anything sensual or family life or procreation or anything like that, if there are differences that should exist between your regard for, your appreciation of a spouse versus someone else, it'd be worth getting clearer on those so that all these forms of community can be fulfilled to the max without fear of a kind of counterproductive blurring of them.
Yeah, Maria?
Two things just come to mind. In the nature of love, spousal would not necessarily mean that love which is actualized after the marriage. It's almost it's a wider term, isn't it? I think perhaps because of the original German admitting and such use of the same term for the kind of love that already begins to grow in the courtship phase. And so, part of, I think, what you're saying might be down to that. But I think what is most crucial here is where we see the place for gift in spousal love. And I'd like to just ask you to try and summarize why it is that in your book you decided not to use the language of gift, but to use the language of corporate union. And then let's try and come back to you on that.
Sure. So the question, first there's the general point that part of the issues we're dancing around here might have to do with the wide scope of the term spousal in spousal love, going back to the German that reaches beyond just what exists only within marriage between vows and death. The second and broader point was why, it seems like an important way to develop the account of marital love, spousal love, is by reference to gift and self-gift. And why is it that this whole book on marriage, doesn't use that language and doesn't engage in it? And then we might go from there. I certainly don't think it's incompatible with that language. And in fact, I think it's just a different gloss on the same concept. So community. I mean, we talk about community, right? And we say that a community is a form of common action oriented towards common ends in the context of a commitment. And we say that there are different basic types of community, and that marriage is the fulfillment of one type of community. And in all those ways, there's lots of convergence with von Hildebrand's thought. Well, community just means the sharing of gifts, in a way. I mean, even to communicate is to share gifts. So I think these are different, flip sides of the same coin. And then the question is, what form does the gift take? And the reason is that just as I think that there are different forms of community, so I think there are different characteristic forms of self-gift for different types of community. And so even the concept of gift, as evocative and rich as it is not going to give us a distinct account of marriage in particular. It needs to be given shape as well. And so in other forms of friendship, other forms of community, you are giving of yourself in the common pursuit with someone else of a certain end. So part of what you're giving is your own capacities, you're giving your time, you're giving your own commitment, and part of the reason for giving those things is not just the ultimate goal that you're going to get, but is also the well-being of the other. That's what it means to be forming a genuine community and not just an alliance to make some purpose, some external purpose easier to attain, right? I mean, you can imagine that. That's the kind of relationship most of us have in economic situations, right? I go to Starbucks, I get a coffee. There's a kind of alliance with the barista. I haven't given much thought to her well-being. I hope I haven't heard it, but there's not a community there. There is a community in a deep kind of friendship where part of the reason that you're pursuing the common activity is not just to get the goal at the end of it, but also to enrich the life of the other person. So that's what I understand by self-gift. And then the question becomes, well, what common end are you giving yourself to the other in pursuit of? And as a result of that, what part of yourself are you giving? And in those respects, again, I'm saying that marriage is comprehensive. You are pursuing together a comprehensive good, not just music or knowledge or sport, but a whole new human being, a new subject of all of those things. And correspondingly, the part of yourself that you're giving is not just your intellectual ability or an act of the will, but in some respect your whole self, heart, mind, and body, because the bodily union, as well as all these other aspects, is part of what you're giving, not just to get the goal, procreation or whatever, but also for the sake of the beloved, himself or herself. So I think gift and community are interrelated. And it may be a rhetorical mistake not to have used the more evocative language of gift, but I think we were trying to get at a similar thing. Community is always formed by gift giving, which involves a self-giving in the process. And then the question is just what gift and what part of the self.
Yes, if you don't mind, just one point of clarification. When I said spousal love, I did mean it's the kind of love that leads to marriage, but that includes the courtship stage, or the falling in love, which of course you can fall out of love, and then that was a spousal love that didn't, or perhaps you thought it was a spousal love, and also God's love for His people can in some ways be considered spousal, and so. I don't mean to use it in a term that strictly limits it to marriage. And then perhaps one more point to the other part of your question. It seems to me one reason the gift language is not used has to do with the approach, the analytic, objective approach that tries to get things very clear and unmistakable for as many people as possible. That language, that method, I think, almost automatically tends to avoid subjects that are just more difficult to grasp, more experiential. They require a kind of deeper sympathy than the objective analytical language requires. So that, I think, goes into the complementarity of the two approaches.
Not seeing any hands right away. I might just probe. Andrew will be the first one, but let me just try to understand better the friendly amendment that you proposed to Hildebrand. Now, if I understood you rightly, your area of concern has to do with the sequence of things. So you lead with the biological unity of man and woman and advance to the whole comprehensive unity. It's true. When Hildebrand leads with the personal, not the biological. So he leads with the idea of a kind of love where persons want to make themselves belong to each other. He thinks the exclusivity arises already here in the inner logic of this will to belong to the beloved person. and a certain self-surrender to the other grows out of this personal kind of love. And then he says, and this unique becoming one flesh in marriage, that enacts fully what has begun as a personal kind of love. So it sometimes says that he thinks of conjugal love as the form, and the sexual energy of man and woman is the matter, which is informed, and not as if it can be arbitrarily withheld. But so, if I'm right, you find something worrisome there in leading with the personal and factoring in the biology of sexual union at a later moment in the inquiry, back in the order of the inquiry of which you spoke. So, am I in the right place, or can you unpack a little more of that concern?
Sure. I think this is important because I wasn't very clear about exactly what I was developing in one respect. I think you could go in either direction of inquiry. And the amendment I would offer is one of emphasis, I think. So let's start with the personal. One of the difficulties here, the thing that I think I was unclear about, is when we talk about conjugal love, I think sometimes people hear by that a certain kind of appreciation of the beloved, a way of looking at and contemplating and taking delight in the good things about a person. So you're going to have a different kind of love in that sense, a different kind of appreciation of an athlete who you're just appreciating the physical abilities of and skills versus a spouse where the sexual is going to enter more directly into what you're appreciating, but not only the sexual, versus a child where you're taking delight in perhaps the similarities between you and your spouse and the child and so on. Okay. So one thing we could mean is appreciation. Another thing we could mean is a certain kind of delight. Okay, so a certain kind of pleasure or emotional attachment or emotional response just in itself. And then another thing we could mean by love is union, right? And von Hildebrand talks about this, that love always seeks union and that union is integral to it. It's part of what makes it an act of love, is that it realizes a union between two people. The sense in which I'm saying you can't separate, not just that it's wrong to separate, but that it's impossible to separate love and this kind of bodily union, is in the last sense. I think if the act isn't oriented towards procreation, whether it's because it's the wrong behavior or because by an act of your own will you have tried to prevent that dynamism, then it's no longer realizing union at all. It's no longer realizing marital union. Because to realize marital union, it has to be a comprehensive union, and to be that, it has to include the bodily. And bodily union is a coordination towards an end. That's what makes for unity. So you can still have the appreciation of the beloved, and you can still have a certain kind of emotional response that's characteristic of marriage. But what you can't have, morally or immorally, is a genuine realization, a real embodiment, a making concrete of your marital love on this occasion. That's the sense in which I think there's a very deep connection between procreation and marital love, where marital love really means marital union, the making one.
Yeah, no, that's good, and that perhaps could be stated more forcefully than Van Hildebrand does. With the sterilizing of the procreative potential, there's a certain compromising of self-donation for love. It's not missing, but it's, reasonably say, underdeveloped. Let's see, Andy, you...
I think I'll pass unless there's nobody else at this point.
Yes. Margaret.
How important do you suppose it is, both for Von Hildebrand and the New Natural Law account, to think about marriage within the context of the totality of flourishing life? So to think about So I think, right, so marriage as a comprehensive union, and there's a totality in that way. But thinking about it sort of in the context of, if you're willing to say it, of a human life moving towards an end, whether it be natural or supernatural, is that something that has to be understood in order to understand marriage? Do you suppose? Did that make sense? That question.
So, do we have to understand the overall well-being and ultimate destiny?
Mm-hmm. Right, and
spouses?
Is that important? Is it important to understand that in order to really articulate the importance of marriage?
Well, just one word on Hildebrand. He sees love as constituted on one hand by the so-called intensio unionis, this will to be one, differently in different categories of love, and then the intensio benevolentiae, this will in the good, the flourishing of the beloved person. And under that rubric, you will get in marriage all aspects of, including the supernatural and eternal well-being of one's spouse. So that will be intensio benevolentiae belongs to spousal love. It may not be your question.
John Henry, do you want to say something before it?
Well, no, it's more a question about your friendly amendment, so
Okay.
if that makes sense, come back to that.
Sure. So I think marriage is in an interesting position with respect to all-around human flourishing, at least for the new natural law view and maybe in general. In a way, from a certain angle, it's superfluous, right? Because it's not necessary. It's much easier to imagine a life without marriage, and in fact, we know many very happy and fulfilled people who are in just that position, than it is to imagine a life without any of the other basic goods that the new natural law account gives: friendship, aesthetic experience, knowledge, health. And so, in a way, marriage has a peculiar status in that respect. It has an optionality to it that is unusual. And I think actually that this somewhat speaks to its value, because the same thing is true of the bodily ends that marriage involves. There is, with respect to the species, reproduction is obviously integral. With respect to the individual, it's not. So there's a kind of superabundance, to take a von Hildebrandian term, to the ends of marriage in that respect, that they're not necessary to keep going yourself, whereas all your other bodily ends are. You don't have a good circulatory or any other system, it's over. Whereas if you don't have reproduction, you can be just as fine. So I think actually that points to a kind of borderline natural, supernatural value of marriage, which is that it reflects God's action in that way. God did not have to create for any reason at all, and in creating did not benefit personally in any way. Right, and so the language we develop theologically for that is the idea that it redounds to his glory. But it's not like his glory was lacking anything if he did not create. There's something very similar about that in married love, which is, I imagine, one of the reasons it's such a constant metaphor in Revelation for divine love. It's superabundant in the sense that it's not for me, it's for the beneficiary of it. And it participates in that way. I think then the other thing is that, of course, you need revelation, and the revelation of the supernatural aspect of man's final end, in order to understand the full significance of marriage. Because I think, John Paul was very clear on the idea that marriage points to the kingdom and points to certain aspects of the kingdom in a certain way. I think, by the way, both von Hildebrand and the New Natural Law account give us the tools for seeing how. The kingdom involves a union of all as members of one body, Christ. Bodily union is only possible between two people at a time in this life, but only in one good, which is marriage. So marriage points to what it could possibly mean, gives us a sense of why it might be valuable to be one at all levels, one body, one spirit in Christ. So it points to that aspect of the kingdom. And of course, that then gives you a deeper appreciation of its value, which is why it's not, which is why revelation is integral to understanding something.
Yeah, so this is really a question maybe more to seek clarification from you, because I don't know whether you would disagree with this. So being very much myself shaped by the Hildebrandian perspective with regard to conjugal love, there's something deeply true to experience. And so with regard to your friendly amendment, I wonder whether in the Hildebrandian vision there isn't, and again I'm not saying it's fully developed here, but is there not perhaps something important in an account of conjugal love that has a kind of logic of its own, so that love can be explained without immediate reference or direct reference to the bodily union? Because there's something in the Hildebrand which is very beautiful, which is that as conjugal love grows, it somehow of its own logic then begins to seek this union. But it doesn't have to have it initially. And one of the things that's very interesting is the way in which this initial conjugal love can somehow purify, a kind of concupiscent interest in members of the opposite sex. And as you have this sense of the beauty of the other, I think it explains somehow some of these great examples in literature. The Beatrice moment, for example, in Dante, where you have this overwhelming impression of the beauty of the other. And I don't think it's quite as unusual as that. I mean, I think I can even speak to that. I recall very much in my own courtship this kind of moment in which this love somehow gives you the strength and empowers you to overcome a certain lower, perhaps even purely biological attraction, and then out of the inner logic of the love itself, a kind of desire for union grows. And so I'm offering that more as a kind of account of maybe my own experience, and I think the way that Hildebrand thinks, so as to show perhaps why it's still valuable to try to articulate conjugal love and union in a distinct way. It maybe isn't, perhaps that creates certain problems. Then you made a very intriguing point this morning about how you don't doubt, for example, that members of the same sex can have a kind of affection for each other that becomes problematic then, right? Because it's unrealizable. So I just wonder what you think if you, first of all, you think there's anything to what I'm saying, or whether there's maybe some reason for the Hildebrandian, I don't want to say separation, but finer distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for the live stream, the question is about, isn't there something true to experience and valuable and worth holding on to in the von Hildebrandian idea that that the beginnings of conjugal love really are prior to any reference to bodily union or procreation or family life or sex or sensuality? Isn't that actually capturing something that a lot of us have experienced at the very earliest stages of attraction or courtship, and that might in fact give us the tools for purifying what begins as a more concupiscent and more biology-focused love anyway?
I might even add, I think one could even argue that it may be somehow an indicator that it is genuine conjugal love, that you precisely move away from a kind of, sort of spontaneous biological interest in members of the opposite sex to a certain ability to detach. That kind of sense of distance and relation, so that the person emerges. So I just add
that. And so it may even be better because in a certain respect, because your first thoughts aren't about sex, you're really appreciating the person in a way, and this may be a sign that it is a healthier or more robust or more genuine example of conjugal love as opposed to concupiscence, which is just an imitator. Let me first say that I think that's still compatible with the amendment I wanted to make. So the amendment I wanted to make is just that you don't realize conjugal love in an act that's contracepted. And the reason you don't is because conjugal love seeks total union. And total union requires bodily, and bodily union requires coordination. Coordination requires an end. Okay. All of that is compatible with saying that the earliest, most incipient kind of experiences of this form of love won't make reference to that, and that may be a good thing. That the fact that comes later may mean that it is a response to this person of the opposite sex, and not just a response to the opposite sex, as von Hildebrand nicely says. And I do think that is a feature of experience. I think that's definitely something that's familiar to a lot of us, this sense, this very early tug towards another person that Where if you asked, it would seem beside the point at that stage to talk about sexual union. It's really just a kind of fascination with the other. Now, what does that tell us? Does that tell us anything that needs to be incorporated at this stage of the philosophy? I don't know. I mean, I think in all cases, that tug, if it's really to be distinguished from the tug that can sometimes happen even in a very close friendship, is a response to a perceived complementarity, right? You might not be able to put your finger on exactly what makes this person a different kind of human being from you, but somehow that tug is an attraction to the possibility of being completed in a certain way. It's hard not to sound really kind of hallmarky about this, so forgive me. And I think it's totally fine, sort of conceptually, morally, whatever, that it only takes that you have to take more steps to spell out what that completion is a completion toward. And that when you spell it out, it won't just make reference to a particular act, but it'll make reference first from the act to the fruit of the act to the kind of to the way of life that is the best context for that fruit, right? So all of family life. And so when people talk about, I want to share my life with this person, right? I want to be one with them. I want to have breakfast every, what are they talking about? I mean, they're spelling out the features of family life. And you can have family life before you have your first child and after your last one goes to college, and even in the case where there are no children, but it's the form of life that's made sense of by this orientation. So it's, in other words, I think it's that there are finer and coarser degrees of resolution, but that the core features of marriage are somehow shot through them all the levels. And and that's one way of preserving the idea that you can begin to spell out the experience of this love, and yet its genuine and complete fulfillment in a particular act, embodiment in a particular act, requires openness to life. Sorry, one more thing, and then we'll go to that also explains why. I mean, everything I just said leaves it open that some people will perceive a certain kind of difference, the kind of difference that's the condition for this tug, even with someone of the same sex. Yeah. And you can debate then, maybe part of the difficulty is that it's a misperception because there isn't that potential for completion, and people then who disagree with that would say, well, no, there may be a different kind of completion. It doesn't matter whether it's completion towards family life or something else. It can still make sense. But it's interesting, I think, that, or at least it leaves it unsettled. To say that this is a response to a felt difference and to a felt complementarity leaves it unsettled whether, in fact, as a matter of experience, some people feel it where there's no sexual difference in particular.
I would simply say, I think this may be, while we're exploring convergences and differences between the new natural law and the Hildebrand position, I don't know whether I think there's a certain silence here. There's no one maybe entirely disagrees with what you're saying, but in certain respects I sense still that perhaps structurally it's more than just kind of two different accounts that more or less overlap. And I say that not so much to suggest that this have to lead to a kind of parting of the ways. I think there's overall obvious compatibility, but because my instinct is that there's still something, perhaps this preoccupation with persons in the Hildebrand, which is by which I don't mean to say spiritual person somehow in some object body. Yeah. Simply this deep sensitivity for what is distinctively personal in us, which defines his whole work. Perhaps would at least see him dissatisfied with this. Perhaps he would still consider it somehow, or to put it in the terms of Wojtyła in this great essay, too cosmological, not personal enough. And
so this is great. I think this may well be a point of tension, and I think that one way of putting my concern is that it is this. I agree that this harder to articulate or specify tug is important and valuable and a key part of experience not to be denied. But at the levels of generality that I think von Hildebrand describes it, before he makes reference to these other things, I think it's actually something that it is possible and maybe even valuable to have in other forms of love as well. And then the challenge will be to and it may well be that part of what I'm objecting to is not the idea of this kind of love, but just some of the descriptions that von Hildebrand has given it. So to say that it is the love where love is most central, or it's the form of regard for someone where the love of the other is the most central thing rather than any particular cooperation, that maybe you can still hold on to the idea that there's a way of describing it, a different way of describing it, that would really distinguish it from deep friendship, from companionship, from love that's proper within a family or something like that.
At the very least, it seems also that, you probably have surely heard that it's not so much an objection maybe, but a point that is sometimes made to your position that it has a kind of abstract nature. And so people feel sort of beaten at the level of argument, but, it's certainly like in the same-sex marriage issue, they feel somehow unconvinced. And in that respect, perhaps the Hildebrandian preoccupation with experience and the desire to do justice to that is a useful complement to the work that the New Natural Law is starting.
Yeah, and it may well be that when he's writing at a time when this part of the debate, the discussion, is just taken for granted by everybody. And the idea that there is a distinctive kind of regard and mutual pull between a man and a woman is so uncontroversial that it doesn't require the kind of specification and defense that I'm pushing for.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Okay, a lot of my thought has already been covered in that discussion, but essentially, I wanted to highlight for anybody, and that may be thinking the same way or not, this discussion is about methodology, okay? And it's two ways of approaching the truth that have different characteristics and different strengths and different weaknesses. The same truth, and there's agreement by everybody that I can see. And you are correct to point out that there are dangers in the phenomenological approach, but it's also true that there are dangers in the approach that you're taking, which I think you would sign up to pretty readily. But they also have their advantages. And I don't think any of us need to be chagrined that we've gotten, 1 week of von Hildebrand and, 3 hours that you may be here and, throwing, kicking sand in his face, so to speak, to use an old analogy. So that's pretty much been covered, and I just reiterated.
Yeah, so he's making the point that there's a lot of complementarity to these approaches, that to some extent there's at least significant overlap in conclusions and ultimate accounts of this good and love and sexuality and marriage, and that there are different approaches with different strengths and weaknesses each. And I completely agree with all of that. And I find myself, and this is in my own experience, I find myself reading von Hildebrand at some points and saying, what does he mean here? What I want him to spend more time on this concept, this kind, whatever, whether it's the regard between the conjugal regard, incipiently conjugal regard that without reference to these other goods yet, or and so on. Sometimes I want more clarity, and then sometimes I'm reading him, I'm saying it's so true to experience. It's the kind of thing that can move you to action, whether in your own life, much less in a social context, in a way that the more plodding accounts of the analytic method will not give you. And I think the reason that this is such a valuable discussion is that to the extent that these things can be integrated more, everybody would benefit, I think. And if as a result of this discussion we get a clearer picture of this kind of regard that's the beginning of conjugal love, then that's going to be a great thing for everybody involved. And it's going to give us a deeper appreciation of something that we may be experiencing all along, but which to give a name to can itself have some effect on experience as well.
Maybe just one more question.
to me. The defense of marriage here, it's geared towards our particular debate right now regarding same-sex marriage. And I think so much of your argument, since it does rest on this sort of the union as towards generating life, and there's sort of a debate we lost a long time ago of contraception. And so as far as speaking to the broader public, and here you're not going to find so much opposition. But I think since so much of this argument rests on the end of marriage, the procreative end of marriage, which has sort of been bracketed off by a lot of people as something they can turn on and off when they want. Have you found that has given you problems in presenting this to other people, and maybe the von Hildebrandian approach, not giving an end run around that, but give something like another way to approach people through their experience?
Sure. So the question is about whether people have so bracketed the procreation, family life orientation of marriage for decades. Doesn't that give me a huge obstacle when I'm talking to audiences where there's less agreement on that part? And might the von Hildebrand account really give you another way to connect with people and then bring them closer because of its emphasis on experience and these aspects of conjugal love? And so the answer is yes. The general thing to do, of course, whenever you have significant disagreement with people, is to try to find the common ground and show them why that common ground actually pushes them more towards your view, if you think that it does. The way we've done that is by saying there is no account of permanence, of exclusivity, of monogamy, even of the idea that marriage is an inherently sexual union, as opposed to some other deeply affective bond, that would not ultimately have to point to something like conjugal union or comprehensive union, with the unified account that gives of permanence and exclusivity as comprehensive commitment, of the sexual union, and family life as elements as comprehensiveness of union and of ends, and so on. Von Hildebrand is giving us another and much more resonant way of doing that, saying, begin with what is in your experience of sexual or romantic or conjugal desire and conjugal love, and try to spell that out in a way such that you can explain its fulfillment. And if you do, you're going to be coming closer and closer to this vision of marriage. I'll just say that I think that this is... So I think in that respect, it's giving you another way to do the same thing. Start with the common ground and try to move out from there. On the other hand, part of what I'm afraid of is that certain articulations of that, beginning common ground, people will be very happy to sign up for. Yes, I want to share my life with this person. I want to face the world together. I have an appreciation not just of this or that great thing about the person, but of the whole person all at once in this kind of unified insight that draws me to him or her, and I want to share everything, and that's why I want, all the same benefits and all the same, and a life of cohabitation where this is recognized by all of society as us being a unit facing the world together, and so on. And the more you try to spell out the ways in which that might still be different from the good that you're talking about, I think the more you're going to look, not just at procreation, and typically, if I'm in a pretty traditional Catholic audience, the opposition is from the other end, that I don't emphasize procreation enough because I'm talking about comprehensive union as this thing that has value in itself, even apart from its ability to stabilize society and tame the barbarians. And, that's really heretical. And, nobody says it's heretical, but it raises suspicions on the other end. So I'm saying, no, procreation is a part of the most basic account, but the most basic account itself is really total union, total self-gift. So this is an attempt to spell out total self-gift in a way that explains why the common ground that people are usually quite happy to sign up for points in this direction and not just towards any sharing of home life and sexual intimacy. Okay? Great.
Did you still want to add something?
No,
You looked like you were reaching for
I'm turning it all over in my mind, but I'm very grateful to Sherif for the discussion. I found it very helpful and clarifying. Did you, Jules, have anything to add?